Let's explore the Terry Gilliam film Brazil, made in 1985. Brazil is one of the great explorations, I think, of how the capitalist system functions and how it keeps people adhered to it, how it keeps people invested in the functioning of capitalism, even if they aren't beneficiaries so much of the system. What's interesting in the film, I think, is that the system controls people not through the way it functions well, but through its failure to function properly. So its inability to really work is what creates its control and how its control operates. You might say that at every point, the mechanisms of control in the film undermine utility. And I think this is a really important way in which the film is talking to us about the capitalist system, that it's not, and this is what apologists for capitalism always say about it, that it helps us producing useful things. But what's interesting about the film is that at every point, the system is undermining utility. It's making things not useful. Things that are just practical and useful are actually outlawed. And the figure of utility, ironically, is one of the outlaws. It's Harry Tuttle, played by Robert De Niro, and he's the great enemy of the system precisely because he just goes in, fixes things, keeps things working. And this makes him an enemy of the state. Or you might call him an enemy of the regime. So Harry Tuttle is an enemy of the regime just because he gets things done, allows things to function in the way that they are made to function. So keeping things going, keeping things working properly is, in the film's way of thinking, a great radical act. So Harry Tuttle's a radical figure just because he keeps things going. Let's take a look at the scene where he comes to Sam Lowry to his assistance.
Just a minute. What was that business with the gun?
Just a precaution, sir. Just a precaution. I've had traps set for me before now. And there are plenty of people in central services who'd love to get their hands on Harry Tuttle.
Are you telling me that this is illegal?
Well, yes and no. Officially, only central service operatives are supposed to touch the stuff. Would you hold this, please? But nowadays, with all the new rules and regulations, they can't get decent staff anymore. So they tend to turn a blind eye, as long as I'm careful. Might find you if ever they could prove that I've been working on their equipment. Well, now that's a pipe of a different color.
Well, wouldn't it be simpler just to,
work with... for me, please?
Sorry, yes. I was saying, wouldn't it be simpler to work for central services?
Couldn't stand the pay. Getting warm.
You couldn't what? Couldn't stand the what?
Paperwork. Couldn't stand the paperwork. Listen, this whole system of yours could be on fire, and I couldn't even turn on a kitchen tap without filling out a 27B/6. Bloody paperwork.
It's Tuttle's very efficiency, his ability to keep things going, that poses a threat to the system. He represents the claims of utility against the excesses of the regime, which are manifested in all the ducts coming out in that scene, all the ducts pouring out of the heating and air conditioning system that Sam has. And it's all these things are stuck behind his wall, but they don't, there's all these ducts, but none of them really work. And they're indicative of the whole excess of the regime itself. What's in contrast, when we see the repair workers come, they don't make things better, they make things worse. So they end up unleashing all these ducts all over Sam's apartment, turning it into a frozen ice box, but they don't do anything to keep it working. So this contrast between the repair workers from Central Services and Harry Tuttle is vital, I think, for understanding what the film is trying to tell us. And here they are, they come, and their very looks suggest that they're not going to actually accomplish anything. They have this weird smile on their face, which indicates that they're figures not of repair and keeping things going, but they're figures of enjoyment. That they're just there really to enjoy themselves, just like the ducks are there for people to enjoy, or for the system to enjoy itself, not to actually serve people, to keep people's homes heated and air conditioned. You might say that the repair workers privilege enjoyment over utility, just like the whole system does. That it's a massive system of enjoyment, and the enjoyment comes at the expense of use or utility. There's a great scene where Tuttle floods the workers' suits with feces or waste product that's coming out of all the different apartments. And in a sense, I think he punishes them with their own product. So this is the excess from people, and they are figures of excess, and he just gives them excess that overflows into them. And I think in a certain sense, they suffocate on their own excess. What's interesting about Tuttle is even though he's a lone ranger, he comes and makes these calls, service calls on his own without anyone seeming to help him. He nonetheless, because he's rejecting the regime's excesses, he is bound in solidarity with others. And this is what leads him to say this great line that he says to Sam as he leaves. We're all in it together. What's interesting about this is Tuttle hasn't just made up this line himself. Instead, he's gotten it from the regime. Happiness, we're all in it together, is the ideological statement of the regime itself. But Tuttle takes this back and actually does suggest that they're all in it together. So it's a different form of solidarity, this ideological togetherness articulated by this billboard versus the anti-ideological solidarity that Tuttle suggests when he talks to Sam. And I think we could say that Tuttle actually turns the ideological slogan into a radical position, so that it's not really the content of the slogan that makes it ideological. It's the form, it's how it's used as propagating the idea of the regime and the collective that the regime wants to create, which is dependent upon some radical exclusions of figures like Tuttle. But Tuttle actually turns this slogan into a form of universal solidarity that doesn't depend on exclusion, that takes up the part of the excluded. And what we see here is a contrast between two different forms of togetherness, one ideological form that relies on exclusion, and one that takes as its point of departure the figures who are left behind or excluded. I think what's interesting is that the inefficiency of the regime is apparent even in its shows of efficiency. So it can't ever become efficient. And I think this is much evidence in one of the great scenes in the film where Sam comes to his new job and he sees the way in which the manager of the new job acts. The boss is constantly in a hurry, trying to seemingly accomplishing a lot, but he never actually does anything. So let's take a look at that scene.
Half as terrorist, the rest as victim.
Mr. Warren.
Yes.
Mr. Warren.
No.
This is facts.
Definitely no.
My name's Larry, Mr. Warren. Sam Larry.
Ah, Larry. Yes.
Sister?
No. Cancel that.
Boys.
Okay. You have to have you on board. Yes. No, don't be ridiculous, Jenkins.
About these invoices.
Yes. You like it up here. Stand back. We've got a crack team of, are they kidding, decision makers. No, in triplicate. I'm expecting big things to publish the finance of. Don't let progress see those. Between you and me, Larry, this no department, tell records to get stuff, is about to be upgraded and
The boss here makes this grand show of great efficiency, but he's walking along really fast, but he's never getting anywhere. So the point is that the enjoyment comes from what's not accomplished. So he's moving along all this with such rapidity, all in order not to do anything. So it's the appearance of efficiency and the enjoyment of this appearance of efficiency that occurs here, but the enjoyment comes from what's not being accomplished. So this interesting opposition between enjoyment and utility, that utility is sacrificed for the sake of enjoyment, that's what the regime reveals to us, and that's actually the source of its power and its control over people. And inefficiency actually produces wild kinds of errors. And this error is shown in the very beginning of the film when a killed insect ends up changing Tuttle to Buttle and ends up killing Buttle. So this little stupid error occurs, and then all of a sudden something that's not supposed to happen happens. So what we're seeing in the film is not a tight system of control, but a system of control that's really at odds with itself all the time and liable to screw up constantly. But what's interesting is it's the errors that the system makes, like Buttle for Tuttle, that end up being the source of its power over people. So it's not that it operates efficiently and thus controls people. It's that it operates inefficiently, and that's the source of its control, because that's the source of the enjoyment that it offers for people who invest in it. The only point in the system is the appearance of work rather than work itself. And we see this at several occasions. We see this in The Boss in the scene that I just showed you, but we see it at other occasions as well. Very early in the film, we see the workers who shift from watching television to appearing to work in a split second. And this is one of the most amazing scenes about the way in which the boss, that work is done for the sake of the boss, but it's only the appearance of work that counts, not the actual work. And this link between appearance and non-utility is central to what the film is doing as well. That the point is, you appear to be doing something all in order not to be actually accomplishing anything. So appearance linked to enjoyment and also linked to lack of utility or non-utility.
Mr. Mr. Lowry, would you step in here, please?
We see here is that no one is sanctioned for not working productively because they put on the appearance of productivity, and they can switch in the quickest instant from non-productive watching of television to the appearance of productive labor, but the labor never really is productive. All it does is make errors. And it's interesting because I think the way in which plastic surgery is shown in the film actually shows the same kind of structure. That it's not performed for the beautiful result that we get from it, but for the enjoyment of the process. So for the appearance that's going on with the plastic surgery, but not even the appearance you end up with, but the appearance of creating a good appearance. That's what the figures in the film enjoy. And here we see that this enjoyment is tied to incredible suffering. People's face ripped apart like this. This is Sam's mother. And what the film is saying is that there's an enjoyment tied to this very reforming of oneself, this appearance of making oneself look better. And it doesn't matter if the results are horrific. No one in the film loses faith in the plastic surgeons, even if it leads to the death of one woman. Nonetheless, everyone still seems to think that what the plastic surgeons are doing is helpful. And it's because I think that people enjoy the process of the plastic surgery, all the different machinations that go into it, rather than the result. So the point is not what you're going to end up looking like. The point is the process that you're going through that shows that you're trying to look better.
The wrinkles and the worry lines,
right up into the wig, into the hairline. Now the template. There, now a bit of sticky. So. And already she's twice as beautiful as she was before. Voila!
We see here that the plastic surgeon really isn't making her more beautiful. All he's doing is inflicting incredible suffering on her. And nonetheless, he's a figure of enjoyment for Sam's mother. That the point of the plastic surgery is to produce enjoyment, not to be useful and produce better looks. We see actually the same thing with the omnipresent ducts, that they're everywhere, they're ubiquitous, and they have the appearance of being efficient, that we use ducts to transport stuff, transport air, transport waste. But actually, I think that we should say that the ducts are vehicles for a useless enjoyment, that an enjoyment that comes at the expense of utility and efficiency. And we see these ducts just overflow everything, and there's nothing really to contain them. And this excessiveness is precisely what enjoyment is. That enjoyment constantly is overflowing limits, overflowing boundaries, and spilling out. And that's what the ducts do. That they don't stay, even though they're vehicles that keep things confined within them, they're constantly spilling out and spilling open, as you can see in this incredible image from the film. The other thing is that there are many more ducts than would ever be necessary for conducting the things that need to be conducted, right? So the film is showing not just the individual ducts breaking open and being excessive, but there's an excess number of ducts, that their figures, the ducts are actually in the film apparent figures of efficiency that actually signify excess. Or you could put it this way, that the function of the ducts is not to function. And we see here that the function of the duct repair people is not to get the ducts working again, but instead to unleash the excess of the ducts, which is what they do when Jonathan comes home to his apartment and Central Services has had a go at it. They've actually made his apartment completely unlivable because they've unleashed the ducts. I would say that the ducts represent the flow of enjoyment through the society. So they don't keep anything else flowing. They, in fact, break up the flow of other things. But enjoyment, that's what they keep flowing through their inefficiency or their break on utility. Now, the film presents terrorism as an apparent alternative. And what's interesting about terrorism is that it responds to the regime not by presenting an alternative kind of logic, but actually mirroring the logic of the capitalist regime. It does this by interrupting the everyday life of the people under the regime with eruptions of enjoyment. So that's what terrorism basically is. It's how can we stop the flow of everyday life with these violent interruptions, these violent breaks with everyday life. What's interesting, though, is that the people we see here Jonathan Pryce's character, Sam Lowry, with his mother, having lunch, a bomb goes off in the restaurant, and they don't even react. So they don't allow the eruption of enjoyment to disrupt their everyday life because they're, in fact, used to it. The regime functions in the same way. So terrorism actually is not a break from the capitalist regime at all, but just a continuation of its logic. We could say that terrorism is a false way out, a way out that seems to be an alternative, but it's not really an alternative at all. And this is because it repeats the very logic, as I say, of the system that it's reacting against. What's compelling about the film, I think, one of the most compelling aspects of the film, is where it locates the source of an authentic possible revolt. And it locates it through fantasy, through the fantasy that that Sam Lowry has, and that actually drives him to act against the capitalist system in which he's immersed. The fantasy seems totally absurd. He's a winged angel who comes to the rescue of this woman who's distressed and hunted by a robotic monster. But he actually, it leads him to act in his real life. In the fantasy, Sam fantasizes himself rebelling against the monster figure and saving Jill Layton, and then that leads him in his real life to attempt the same kind of thing. And on the basis of his fantasy, the fantasy doesn't make him quiet. It doesn't lead him to passivity. Instead, it leads him to struggle against the regime and help Jill break out of it. But in the end, Sam completely enters into the fantasy and has no possibility for acting or revolting anymore. So let's look at this final scene, and we show how Sam loses touch with reality and becomes actually completely a figure of the system he was revolting against because of the fantasy. It actually keeps him trapped.
He's got away from us, Jack. Afraid you're right, Mr. Helpman. He's gone.
This contented look on Sam's face is a look that he's been pacified by the fantasy, which has accommodated him to the system and no longer is linked to revolt. And the point is that fantasy gets linked to revolt only as long as it's tied to some kind of public action or to the public sphere. When it becomes strictly private, it becomes it takes on a pacifying function. What I really like about Brazil is that it shows the double valence of fantasy, that fantasy can have this radical dimension to it and it can be pacifying in the same way at the same time. And the pacifying role of fantasy gets nicely shown through the way that everyone is dependent upon television in the film. And television is a private version of fantasy that creates docile subjects. That's why the television is ubiquitous, because if people are glued to the television, then they can't be questioning the overall structure of the system, and they partake in the enjoyment that the system offers. So television is the vehicle through which you partake in the enjoyment of the system. It's completely violates any kind of utility. It's just there to be consumed. It has no usefulness at all, no practical value. And that's why it offers a source of enjoyment for people that keeps them docile. The film, I think what's really compelling about the film is it does point toward alternative forms of enjoyment other than what the capitalist system and its structure offers. So it offers this enjoyment that it associates with television and violation or lack of utility. But Sam has a fantasy that provides a totally alternative form of enjoyment. And Tuttle has utility. So he enjoys just getting the job done and the connection that provides with other people. We're all in it together, Tuttle thinks, through just getting the job done, through work. So Tuttle is really, you might say even that he's a figure of the proletariat that this film identifies as a site of possible revolt against the capitalist system. But in the end, I think what the film is suggesting through the path that Sam takes, and this is true of Tuttle as well, because he also occupies this position of symbolic death, that revolt is only possible through the disinvestiture of symbolic death. So Tuttle as I just said, is one who operates as dead to the system. He's outside of the system. He refuses to invest himself in it, or he has disinvested himself in it, from it. Sam kills Jill officially, and this temporarily frees her from the structure, like she's from the structure of the system. She's no longer sought out by the authorities once they think that she's dead. And this leads to one of the great lines in the film when she says to him, "Look, care for a little necrophilia?"